Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and of course those who are confused, you are welcome to a new episode of the Ford Focus. Recently, I had an opportunity to interview Douglas Carswell. He is the director of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. Prior to that, he had an illustrious career as a British MP representing Clacton and Harwich. Additionally, he was among the leaders in Brexit that brought it from the Nigel Farage fringe into the mainstream, allowing it to succeed at the ballot box, which allowed the United Kingdom an opportunity to reclaim their freedom from bureaucrats in Brussels and will hopefully, over time, greatly improve life in the United Kingdom. Currently, as director of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy that he runs now, is a 501c3 organization that promotes reducing regulation, lower taxes, and educational reform. Only idiots would oppose what the Mississippi Center for Public Policy stand for or entrench special interest. Sometimes they're the same. And this came about because he was extremely frustrated with the asinine policies of Great Britain during COVID-19 and wanted freedom. So when people want freedom, they come to Mississippi. Therefore, as of January 2021, he has been the director of this center and has taken it to new heights and has put it on the map and has been very influential in guiding public policy. Ultimately, our interview covered several important facets. One, what's the purpose for Mississippi Center for Public Policy? Two, educational reform and why it's important. Three, the cancer of critical race theory in education. And 4 ways we can make Mississippi more competitive, particularly in the regulatory and tax environment, along with, quite frankly, crime. Because people need to be safe, they need low taxes, and they don't need burdensome regulations. And if you do those things, you will create businesses. If you don't believe me, look to Texas, Florida, Tennessee. Those states have been rocking it. And here's a secret, folks. Mississippi is poised to kick ass in manufacturing. We are on I-55 and Interstate 20, 2 hours from the Gulf Coast, and 45 minutes from the Mississippi River, and 48 hours from anywhere in the country by truck. If we implement the right policy solutions in education, taxes, and regulation, we will be at the forefront of the reinvigoration of American manufacturing over the next several years. That is why the Mississippi Center for Public Policy is so important, and why you should donate to them generously. Ultimately, to reach our potential, I think Mississippi has a lot of potential. May be wrong, but I'm an optimist. Forgive me. I think if we do the right things, the sky's the limit as far as what we can achieve here. Ultimately, my goal with this podcast is to highlight some of the ways we can reform, what needs fixing to make Mississippi number one in the good stuff instead of all the bad stuff, because it's time and we can do it. Without further ado, let's get into the interview, because it's going to be a nice, informative, great interview. I think you will get a lot from, because I certainly did. Appreciate you doing this. I guess one of the big questions is, you've lived a very dynamic life. I mean, how and why Mississippi from England?
Well, I think anyone who's been in Mississippi for more than about 5 minutes knows that it's the greatest state in the Union. America is a wonderful country, and I think sometimes people who live in America don't appreciate just how extraordinary the United States is. It is full of the most inventive and creative and brilliant people. I don't just mean that because I happen to bump into and work alongside and meet Americans every day and I enjoy their company, but just look and think of what America has achieved. This is a country that's only 4% of the world's population, and yet from the age of powered flight to the age of the internet, it has been at the forefront of pretty much every human innovation. It's not surprising that people from every part of the planet want to come here, and I'm one of them, and I've had the great fortune not only to come but to do something that I really love doing in what I think is the greatest state in the union. So, you know, it's kind of a no-brainer. Would I rather be doing what I'm doing in the UK or here? Much rather doing here. If your business is to promote freedom and liberty, there's no country that compares to the United States.
You know, one interesting thing about Europe is Europe led the world in innovation, and in some ways it kind of felt like it stopped. Was it because of all the regulations and EU? And
I think the really interesting question is, why was it that Europe for about 400 years was at the pinnacle of human achievement? Why was it that the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the Technological Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, why was it that these all happened in Europe? Stop and think about it. Europe is a peninsula on the Eurasian landmass. It has no particular geographical advantages to anywhere else. What was it about this particular part of the world that made it, from sort of probably around 1400 until about maybe sort of 1900, the world's leading part of the planet? A very interesting idea was put forward by a historian called Paul Kennedy, who really influenced how I thought about these things when I was in my late teens and early 20s. His idea in the book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, was that the reason why Europe achieved that extraordinary dynamism was because it didn't have a central political authority. China, which in many ways was far more technologically precocious than Europe, never capitalized on that innovation because it had a unified system of bureaucratic control. The Mandarins, India too, the Ottomans too, all these civilizations were thwarted by the centralization of power. Europe never had that. Despite famously the efforts of various popes and others to create a unified Europe, they were never able to. What's happened in Europe in the past half century is that really for the first time in a millennia, it has created a central political authority, and it has destroyed the true genius of European civilization, which is the ability of different people in different statelets around Europe to try different things. The European Union prevents Europe from having that laboratory of innovation, and it's actually the United States with its 50 different states and its federal system that actually has a model that allows innovation in a way that Europe used to do but has lost the ability
because the distribution of power in a federalist system makes the U.S. too disorganized to really be as bureaucratic.
You use the word disorganized.
In a good way.
Don't use disorganization and chaos are not pejorative terms. They're actually, if you're trying to innovate, whether in the biological world or the public policy world, they're good. Here in Mississippi, we look across the South and indeed further afield and look with hungry eyes at some of the innovation happening in Florida or in Tennessee or in Arizona, and we borrow unashamedly ideas that we see elsewhere, and this allows America to innovate faster. Just take, for example, I don't know, if you're a progressive and you're into saving the planet, look at the innovation that was the adoption of catalytic converters in cars. California insisted upon it. Now the rest of the United States, indeed the rest of the world, followed that great Californian innovation. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say every innovation that's come out of California in recent years has been a good one. But if you want an example of a good conservative innovation, look at what West Virginia has done when it comes to school choice. West Virginia, for heaven's sake, a solidly Democrat state, now allows every child in that state to control their share of the local education budget. And now that innovation is spreading like wildfire. I think 6 or 7 states have now followed West Virginia. So it's this ability to innovate that explains why Europe was the number one and why America today is the number one.
In West Virginia, how did they get there on that policy goal, and what was sort of the key legislation that drove that?
Well, if you talk to think tankers, they will say it was all them, and I think actually, to be fair, there is some truth in that. There is a brilliant think tank run by a chap called Barrett Gallagher, and he is, I think, probably one of the people who's actually changed the future of American education policy. He's been doggedly arguing, Garrett has been doggedly arguing for parent choice. And he's done it in a way that few conservatives managed to do. He's made it almost a moral argument. And the lawmakers in West Virginia, Democrat and Republican, listened to him. In fact, I think I'm right in saying, I may be wrong about this, I think I'm right in saying that the governor may have been a Democrat. Certainly wasn't traditional Republican. And just through sheer persistence and force of argument, mobilizing mums and dads, they secured this extraordinary win. And, you know, at the last count, as of last week, Arkansas had just come out and announced they were going to do something similar by 2025. Iowa passed legislation to allow the same system to be created. Texas and I think Florida are not far behind. Wyoming, I think, is passing the legislation as we speak. So right across America, people are looking at what one state has done and they're deliberately copying it.
Where does Mississippi stand on this right now?
Tragically, Mississippi has a form of legislative inertia that I think we should have little patience for. We've done very little to adopt some of these innovations. 10 years ago, almost to the day, we passed a bill to allow charter schools. Now, charter schools are really important, as I'm sure you know. They're paid for out of general taxation, but they're run independently and they have greater control. They have transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans, often from quite poor backgrounds, and they are undoubtedly a force for good. Unfortunately, in the entire state of Mississippi, a population of nearly 3 million people, we have a total of 8 charter schools. It's a pathetically low total. And I think this is deliberate. I think the good old boys in Jackson do not want a large number of charter schools because it shows them up. It shows how it could be done.
And who's kind of this good old boy network? Is it kind of like Hinds County public schools and that group, or is there kind of other big constituencies there?
I think it'd be unfair to sort of single out Hinds County. There is an establishment, and in a state like Mississippi, parties don't always define the establishment. There was a time when to hold statewide office in Mississippi you had to be a Democrat. It was Democrat controlled for I think 120 years. As of about 20 years ago it flipped and it's now Republican. It's not really a case of Democrat versus Republican. It is more the collusion of minds, often you might say rather small minds, where they decide that they're going to run something for their interests rather than the interests of the children. So for example, you have the payroll in many districts. The education budget is spent in the interests of the payroll, and the schools in many districts are run in the interests of those who work on the payroll. Now, not all. There are some very, very good school districts, Rankin, Madison County, DeSoto County, but there are often a lot of school districts that are run basically in the interests of the people on the payroll.
And one interesting thing I've looked into reading about this is that per pupil spending might be higher in one district, the outcomes are still worse, right? Because of this.
There's almost an inverse correlation between the amount of money spent and the outcomes. Now, you could say, to be fair, that actually that's because the 3 largest districts, DeSoto, Rankin, and Madison, have got A grades and tend to get good economies of scale because they've got so many students there. But actually, even taking that into account, it reveals as a total myth this idea that poor educational outcomes are a consequence of underfunding. For years we've been told that the solution to education is to throw more money at it. I certainly think we could do a better job of paying teachers more. I'm very, very excited to see how Arkansas has said that by 2025 the minimum for a teacher will be $50,000.
Good.
But in return for that, you've got to see the kind of changes they're introducing in Arkansas. In Arkansas, by 2025, every child in Arkansas will have a dedicated education support allowance. Their mum and dad will control their share of the budget. And I think sadly in Mississippi, when we gave teachers this historic pay raise last year, the largest pay increase for teachers I think in 30 years, we didn't use that to also try and incorporate some of these other changes.
You didn't tie the pay to results.
I think not so much pay to results. I think increase the teacher's pay, but the quid pro quo for that is that mums and dads have got to be able to say, I want my child's share of the local budget to go from that school, which is underperforming or not up to what we want, and take it to this school. And I think that this school should be either in their district, it should be maybe a public school, but it also should allow private schools out of district.
Right. And one thought too is, say schools in Madison County are playing at a pretty significant advantage because a lot of the kids come from more affluent families, two-parent homes, compared to kind of the situation in Jackson or other poor counties, right? We had kind of dysfunctional families and other issues that...
I don't really accept the premise of your question. I don't really accept that wealth per se correlates with educational attainment for a very simple reason. In the United States 100 years ago, 150 years ago, there would have been one school classrooms right across this country with a single teacher, a handful of books, who would have produced students who were good at algebra, Greek, Latin, and a whole host of things. The idea that you have to be materially wealthy to be academically successful, I think, is a myth.
No, maybe I should rephrase that, say parental involvement in schools and kind of two-parent families that are engaged and know what the kids are doing, right?
That certainly helps, but again, be slightly cautious. Don't ever underestimate the sheer tiger mum determination of some of the single parent families that I've come across. They want the best for their kids.
I agree. I think there are some very determined single moms out there, but I'm just saying overall, if you can have parents or families pushing the kids as well, that's probably one of the reasons I think Asians do so well in the United States, right?
I think if you've got that culture of wanting the best for your kids, it's really helpful.
Family unit and all that.
Yeah.
And I guess your top legislative priorities, last I read, were along with education, or repealing the state income tax in Mississippi, right?
Yeah, I mean, what are the 2 or 3 things that Mississippi most needs to change? You know, it's alarming how many young Mississippians, bright, smart people, they go to great universities in state. Where do they go? They often end up in Nashville or Dallas or Austin. What can we do to change that? Well, I think there are 2 or 3 things we could really change in terms of public policy to improve the future of the state. Number one, to make the economy more competitive, and that means cutting taxes. We went a long way towards eliminating the state income tax last year. We didn't quite go far enough, but from 2024, I think we'll have a flat 4% income tax rate in the state, which is good. To give you some context, that means we will be more competitive than Alabama and Louisiana and Arkansas, but not quite as competitive as Tennessee to the north, which has no income tax at all. Nor will we be as competitive as Texas and Florida, who don't have an income tax either. But we're definitely moving in the right direction. We also, I think, need to address the education system. We talked about this. And I think the only way to do that is to introduce full-blown choice and competition like Arkansas will be doing. And frankly, if they can do it on that side of the Mississippi River, the laws of physics aren't so different over here, we should be doing it too. Healthcare, though, I think is an issue. And perhaps people don't realise quite what an issue it is. Try to imagine that you are living in a remote part of Mississippi, you've got an income of maybe $30,000, $40,000, a couple of kids. Realistically, private insurance is not an option for you. So what do you do? Now, I think this is a matter of real importance for Conservatives. Conservatives have made it clear they don't want Medicaid expansion, and I understand that and I respect that, and I think that's a good position. But what are we going to do for low-income Mississippi households? What are we going to do to help them? I think we need to think creatively. Maybe the problem is having an insurance-based healthcare system in the first place. You insure your car against having an auto accident, but you don't insure your car against running out of gas, right? That's because you can schedule when it is you're likely to make those payments. a lot of healthcare, particularly primary healthcare, you can schedule when you're going to need to make those payments. So we've been talking to a brilliant doctor in Florida who has set up a subscription model, and he charges patients $80 a month, and for $80 a month you basically get his first class primary healthcare service. And he's able to make it work because he is able to take those cash payments and go straight to third-party providers. He can get huge discounts on his services. We would see something similar in Mississippi if we removed a lot of the restrictive practices, the so-called certificate of need laws governing healthcare, that prevent that model becoming viable in Mississippi. So we really want to remove a lot of the old restrictions on the provision of healthcare in this state, which we think would allow us to provide alternatives to the expensive insurance-based system.
What's the certificate of need mean exactly? How does it work? What's the mechanics behind it?
That's a good point. A certificate of need, known sometimes and appropriately enough by an acronym CON, is literally a common law. It is a piece of legislation drafted in the early 1980s. And it basically says if you provide healthcare in, I think, the following 27 areas, you can't expand provision without a permit. And the people who decide whether or not you get a permit are the existing operators in that field. So, for example, if you wanted to provide, I don't know, a new MRI scanning facility, you wouldn't be able to do so without getting approval from existing MRI providers. Guess what? MRI scans in Mississippi are insanely expensive. Talking to Dr. Gross in Florida, where they don't have these certificate of need laws, he is able to provide patients with MRI scans at a 95% discount from the rate that they would be paying here in Mississippi. Removing these laws allows affordable medicine to be provided for a large number of people. So, and they're very, very complicated, these con laws. They are blatantly and brazenly protectionist, and they price ordinary Mississippians out of being able to access affordable healthcare.
So they're kind of so they're designed in a way to kind of protect the big players in the game.
Totally. Think of it as a law that would prevent Pizza Hut from opening a new restaurant without getting permission from Papa John's. If you did that, pizzas would be expensive, right?
Right. And I guess another consequence of these laws and regulations is it makes it nearly impossible for small doctors to operate independently. Yeah. That's why you see so many bought up, right?
This is the key. This is the key. In order to have the subscription-based primary healthcare model that I think is going to be the key to providing affordable healthcare for Mississippi in the future, you need to allow small doctors, small doctor practices to come along and provide these services. And so long as you've got the certificate of need laws in place, you've got a very effective barrier to entry. Incidentally, don't take my word for it. Look at some of the data on how much more Americans pay for their healthcare compared to other people in other countries. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting you adopt the British system, which is an even worse healthcare system than that in America. But even in Western Europe, Australia, Singapore, ordinary patients in those countries, however they pay, whichever system is used to provide healthcare, those countries all get far more bang for their medical buck than they do in America. And one of the reasons for that is because the insurance model in America inflates and pushes up costs. Lawyers love it. It's bad news for patients and bad news for doctors. There has to be an alternative.
And what was your experience with NHS in England? Why do you say it's such a much worse system than what we have here?
If you are having this conversation in front of a British audience, it's almost considered a form of sacrilege to criticise the National Health Service. In fact, there was a very famous politician, I think it was Nye Bevan, a British politician in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, who described the NHS as the closest thing the British have to a national religion. It is believed by many in Britain that providing healthcare free at the point of use is a mark of a great and civilized society. And if things worked as they're supposed to, I would agree with that. But unfortunately, it doesn't really work like that. Precisely because healthcare in Britain is free, you don't have any pricing mechanism to determine priorities. So what you have instead is a form of rationing known as waiting lists. Now, in Britain, the waiting lists are long. They are often life-threatening. We have some of the worst cancer survival rates in the UK of any country in the Western world because of the delays in getting to see a specialist. So the waiting lists caused by the NHS are not just a bug, they're a feature of the system. They're trying to get rid of waiting lists in the NHS when you retain the socialised model is an impossibility. It's never going to happen. There's been, I think, a lot of dishonesty amongst British politicians. They've tried to tell voters that somehow they can fix this problem, but they can't. And I think the time will come soon in Britain when they realise that, you know, a 4-hour wait for an ambulance or a 6-month wait to see a cancer specialist when you've got the symptoms of cancer are just not good enough. It's a murderously incompetent system. There are other countries that have better publicly funded systems. France, Australia. Australia has a wonderful system using features of the insurance system. I'm not advocating any one of those systems, but I think the British system is probably one of the worst in the world. And the fact that no country in the Western world, the British invented their system in the 1940s, not a single country anywhere in the world has copied the British system.
Is there another private insurance option in England for people who can?
This is part of the problem with the National Health Service. It prevents people from paying as much on their healthcare as they would like. Now, if you look at the amount of Britain's wealth that we spend as a country on healthcare, it's lower than it ought to be, and that is because the socialised system actually suppresses the ability of people to spend as much on their healthcare as they would want to. And part of the reason for that is the NHS crowds out the private sector. Private healthcare is there, but it is extraordinarily expensive, precisely because often if you go private, you will see precisely the same doctor that you would have seen on the NHS, but you'll pay thousands of pounds for it in order to jump the queue. It's not really, private healthcare is not really a viable option for most people.
Okay, so NHS for most, but just for the top lucky few, they have the option to skip the queue, if you will.
I mean, the British system is so bad that you would be better off being diagnosed with a serious life-threatening condition and being poor in the Delta in Mississippi than in most of the UK. Your cancer survival rates in Mississippi would be better for most people than they would be under the British socialised system.
Wow. And I guess another thing too, to pivot, it's good with you, is I was reading through here, one of those other top priorities at Mississippi Center for Public Policy is critical race theory and all that entails. What brought that about, and kind of what are y'all doing within Mississippi to combat it?
Well, critical race theory is this idea that Americans are not all individuals, they're not all equal, and they're not all in possession of inalienable rights. In other words, it's an idea that is directly contrary to the founding ideals on which the Republic was built. What critical race theory does is present a form of revised Marxism. Marx has traditionally said the world was divided between the proletariat and the capitalist class who exploited them. What critical race theory does is it divides the world up not between classes, but by race and gender. It says there's a hierarchy of oppression, and you have the oppressed and the oppressors. It's nonsense. It's a form of delusional thinking, but it's a very dangerous delusion because it encourages young Americans to grow up and think that their life chances and their trajectory as to where they get to in life is not down to their personal conduct and their personal behavior, but it's somehow a consequence of the system of systemic prejudices and privileges. It demotivates Americans. It sets Americans against each other. It's also, frankly, absurd because a lot of people who advocate for critical race theory argue that the different outcomes in American society are caused by the system rather than behaviours. And it therefore denies agency to precisely the people that the progressive left seeks to champion. So it's dangerous and foolish. But the problem is, it's taken off in American academia like wildfire, and it's jumped from university campuses into the HR departments of big corporations, into corporate America, into the public bureaucracy in America. And ideas that would have once been considered not just mad but offensive are now openly advocated by people who ought to know better. So what do we do about it? Well, here in Mississippi, we passed a law to ban the promotion of critical race theory. Now, it's difficult as to how you might do that. You can't ban ideas. So we basically, in the spirit of Martin Luther King, who famously spoke of America being a country in which his little girls will grow up judged on the content of their character rather than the colour of their skin, very much in the spirit of Martin Luther King, we tabled legislation that would say that you can't use public money to teach young people that one group of Americans is inherently superior or inferior to another group of Americans based on their immutable characteristics. However, you sadly can't really defeat critical race theory by passing laws. You've also got to engage in the battle of ideas. I think the reason why critical race theory has taken off is because, however flawed it is, it at least presents young Americans with an overarching explanation of how the world is and how it came to be. We conservatives need to be much better at doing that. We need a counter-narrative to the left's narrative. Well, we were focused on things like tax cuts, a great thing, tax cuts. Well, we were focused on the minutiae of economic reform. The left was promoting this narrative, and we need to advocate a counter-narrative.
And it was a very insidious, because they slowly got a hold in universities and it's kind of gradually worked its way through. One thought I've had is that maybe could help is Mississippi public employees retirement system looked at maybe pulling investments from Vanguard and BlackRock and a lot of these other big funds that promote a lot of this nonsense?
Well, I think in a free market, you shouldn't ever try to pass a law that tells private capital how it should invest. If people want to put their own money in frankly daft ideas, that's up to them. Who am I? Who's anyone to decide what is and isn't a daft idea? The history of capital investment is full of South Sea bubbles and tulip bubbles, and
Right.
let people throw their money at what they want. The issue is whether or not it is actually these big investment funds' money in the first place. If you run a big investment fund, you are a trustee. You don't actually own the capital. It's your retail and institutional investors' capital, and you invest it on their behalf. Now, normally in a functioning free market capitalist system, the investors of other people's money have what's known as a fiduciary duty. That means a duty of trust. You are entrusted to do certain things with that money. That's not to say you always will, but your intent should always be to maximize returns. Now, if you invest somebody else's money and you aim to maximize returns, whether you do maximize returns or you don't, if that is your primary aim and everything you did was intended to maximize returns, I don't think you can be held responsible for failing to do that. You fulfilled your fiduciary duty. If you are making investment decisions not to maximize the capital returns, but to prioritize certain things for basically political reasons. If, for example, you run a $1 billion fund and you decide that actually you're not going to invest in oil and gas because you don't like what the oil and gas industry are doing, and you believe that by cutting carbon dioxide emissions you can save the planet. If you're not making it clear to the people who own that capital that that is what you're doing, then I think you would be in breach of your fiduciary duty, and I hope that lots of class actions will follow.
And is that why a lot of people who push this are trying to redefine fiduciary duty as stakeholder capitalism?
Correct. You've got to bear in mind that one of the consequences of having low interest rates for so long, and all this candy floss credit that central banks have been creating for 20, 30, some might even say longer years, one of the consequences of this is that it makes a lot of people who are quite mediocre and third rate appear like geniuses. There are plenty of hedge funds in New York and Connecticut and London that are basically run by people who borrow a great deal of money very, very cheaply and invest it and get moderate returns against what they're having to pay on what they've borrowed. And if they do that at a large enough scale, they look rather clever and they look like rather smart hedge fund managers. I suspect that one of the consequences of higher interest rates is that a lot of the people who manage money, who decide that they're going to invest in pursuit of this faddish idea or that fashionable notion, are going to probably look rather silly in a few years' time. So, there will be a correction, I think, in the market. I'm not sure that it necessarily needs as much federal government intervention as we think it does. I think higher interest rates will mean that an awful lot of ESG investing looks rather foolish. There's going to be a big bubble correction, I think, in green energy. You're already starting to see this bluntly. You're already starting to see companies like BP and I think Shell, who have been slow to get out of renewables, starting to realize that they should have got out faster. You're starting to see some of the, Exxon and others are actually now looking like quite good bets. So, never underestimate the ability of daft ideas to look like smart ideas when interest rates are low. I think a lot of ESG investing will prove to be a short-term and foolish fashion caused by low interest rates.
And I guess my thought is I don't think it's something our public pensions should be funding or participating in.
Absolutely. If you run the PERS system in Mississippi, you have a fiduciary duty to make sure that you maximize returns, particularly with PERS. I mean, there are serious problems to do with the PERS system anyway. There's a question about whether or not, given current tax rates, we're going to be able to afford the generous system. And it's a hugely sensitive political issue. There are lots of very hard-working Americans who've retired in the expectation that they're going to have a certain level of income. But given the financial stresses that are already going to be placed on the PERS system, the last thing we want are the people who run that system doing anything other than seeking to maximize returns. We tried to push a bill on ESG investing to address this. Like with critical race theory, we've got to be careful we don't fool ourselves into thinking that you can make laws to address everything. But I think our ESG bill would have helped.
Right. And I guess one of the best ways to probably combat this from a long-term standpoint is to make sure you have a good civics and history base within primary education and secondary as well.
Yeah. I grew up with great teachers who taught me about the American founding. They taught me a lot of British history. They taught me a lot of history about the scientific revolution. I think if you're growing up in the Western world in this day and age, you need to have a good understanding of the foundations of Western thought and the Western system. You need to understand, for example, that the world is full of republics, but there's only really a couple of really successful republics, the United States and Switzerland and one or two others. You need to understand why that is. You need to understand that America was founded on quite a revolutionary principle, the idea that all of us are created equal in possession of inalienable rights. You need to understand that, and I think if young Americans are brought up to understand that, it brings them together irrespective of their background and their heritage and their ancestry. One of the reasons why America works, and I know it's fashionable to criticize things that go wrong in America, but don't ever underestimate how successful America is. America still works. And I think one of the keys to its success, the keys to its social cohesion, is this fact it's got this extraordinarily compelling story as a country. You can come from any background, and if you play by the rules and you work hard, you can make it.
I remember Churchill once said, America will always do the right thing once it's exhausted all the alternatives.
Isn't that what happens in a democracy?
Yes.
The key, we saw this during COVID actually. During COVID, we saw Western countries and different states in the United States try all sorts of different things. And Now, I was driven to distraction by the sheer stupidity of the British government, for example, in doing all sorts of ridiculous things with mask mandates, and they got it wrong, and they got it wrong. But we recognised that we got it wrong and reversed it after exhausting all the possibilities. It was China, supposedly efficient, rational, authoritarian China, that ended up compounding its errors years after the rest of us had figured out how to respond. So I think democracies generally, and America in particular, have this correct mechanism. That's not to say that they won't do lots of things that are wrong. I look at the current administration in DC, and my goodness, I think they're doing lots of things wrong. But this is the extraordinary thing about America. It has the ability to correct its mistakes.
What do you think gives America that ability? The dynamism of it, that you have just so many new ideas flowing in, or?
I think if you want to explain America's genius, you've got to basically hinge your answer around a series of decisions that were made in a courthouse in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. That's the key moment. That was when freedom and liberty were hardwired into the Constitution. If you look at what the Founding Fathers were trying to do, they were trying to figure out, if you've overthrown not just the power but the authority of what came before, how do you create a system that avoids what the British had? We had our revolution 100 years before you guys did, and we ended up with a military dictator, Cromwell. How do you avoid some of the problems that the Dutch had when they removed their stadtholder and tried to run the country without an overbearing monarch? How do you try and tackle it? And the American Founding Fathers did this. If you look at the Federalist Papers, they looked at the Venetian system, for example, where you have an elected doge running it rather than a monarch. And what the Americans did is they borrowed heavily from the British system, or I should say the English system. But the real genius is they looked back at the Roman Republic. They looked back at the way that the Republic was structured. They were able to do something that the English, after their revolution, weren't able to do. Polybius had been translated into the English language in the intervening 100 years. So the Founding Fathers were able to read Polybius and understand that Rome was a great success as a republic because it had a series of competing magistrates. And I think this gave them the idea of the separation of powers. You had different magistrates in competition. Here in Mississippi, you've got a microcosm of that. You've got an elected governor. You've got a lieutenant governor. You've got all these different officials elected, kind of in competition with each other. You've got different houses in the legislature. The whole system is geared to not allowing any one faction control. And that Roman idea, incorporated by the Founding Fathers into the Constitution, I think explains why this republic is even more successful than the earlier Roman one.
Of course, in the UK, you guys have a parliamentary system over there. So how does it work from a local level? Do kind of mayors and town councils have a lot of power over there, or how's that?
On the downside, the British system is far, far, far too centralised. And that only really became apparent to me when I moved to America. And I realised that actually you really do have 50 different ways of doing things. I mean, it's just glorious how often in Mississippi people will decide things and they will, the fact that they do something different in another state is often immaterial. This is what we want to do in Mississippi, so we'll do it this way. Britain is far more centralised, and I think it's extraordinary how it becomes the business of an official in London, often terrifyingly the Prime Minister in London, to decide things like whether or not schools should be shut on a particular day. I mean, during COVID, literally, the Prime Minister was giving speeches and issuing edicts that micromanage the entire country in a way that no US president, no state governor would be able to do. So it's a much, much, much more centralised system. I mean, the British parliamentary system is a pretty good answer to the question of how you disperse power. It was a system that evolved much earlier than the American system. The key moment, I think, in British political history was the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89, about almost 100 years before the American Revolution. And we didn't have any knowledge of the Roman system. We couldn't try to recreate that. So we tried what we thought was the best thing, eventually having had a military dictator, Cromwell, which didn't work out too well, having then restored the monarch, which didn't work out too well. We then imported a Dutch monarch, William and Mary, in the hope that Dutch monarchical minimalism would become the norm in England. And in effect, that system worked from sort of 1688 onwards. It worked pretty well until, I would say, the 1930s. The parliamentary system worked pretty well. And it produced a country that was certainly not a republic, but it had many of the features of a republic: dispersed power, the monarch was very weak. And it worked pretty well until about the 1930s. Since the 1930s, I think it's really failed. Parliament has basically lost control of the power of the purse strings. Individual members of Parliament can't move amendments to budgets. It's become a rubber stamp, in effect, since the 1930s. And this is reflected in the fact that the country, since the 1930s, has been largely badly governed.
So, in a way, the Prime Minister and the Privy Council running the big departments sort of hold a lot of the power in the UK.
Not really, no. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet and the elected officials only really exercise power notionally. Real power is in the permanent bureaucracy over which they notionally preside. And it's a bit of a fiction that the Prime Minister and ministers make decisions. In reality, British Prime Ministers are the facade. It's the permanent bureaucracy, the administrative state in Britain, that runs things.
And I guess you see that in the United States as well, with sort of all the FCC.
The administrative state is certainly powerful in America. The rot is not quite as far set in as it is in Britain. I mean, in the United Kingdom, for example, I was talking to a minister friend of mine quite recently, and she had been a minister for about 10 years. And when she first became a minister, she had tried to achieve a series of reforms. And after a decade in cabinet, in some of the highest offices in the land, she had failed to secure these reforms because the permanent bureaucracy didn't want to do it, and so they didn't do it. The elected officials in Britain have largely been usurped by the standing bureaucracy. In America, at least, when you get a new administration, all the senior officials are appointed anew. You supposedly get conservatives to run the alphabet soup bureaucracy. In Britain, that never happens. You will have a permanent secretary running a department. The Prime Minister will run a department, but will be unable to appoint more than maybe 2 people as assistants. How can you possibly control a government if the people you put in charge of departments don't have the power to hire and fire the people who work in them?
Right. And is there a revolving door in those bureaucracies between that and lobbying in the private sector in England? Is it kind of like here where you'd see that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the real lobbying that goes on in Britain is between the vested interests and the permanent bureaucracy. There's not much point, if you're a British lobbyist, in trying to win support from politicians because they don't really have much power. Take, for example, defence procurement. In Britain, big contractors who want to secure contracts don't really waste their time schmoozing MPs because irrespective of who you elect and irrespective of what elected politicians think, it's the bureaucracy that allocates or misallocates, or some might say disastrously misallocates, the defence budget.
Very interesting on that, how it works there. And one big difference in UK versus the United States is y'all have a lot shorter election cycles. Seems like in the United States you're in constant campaign mode.
Yeah, in Britain the longest that a parliament can go is 5 years. But I'm just trying to think, the whole time I was in parliament, I don't think a parliament went for 5 years. I was in parliament for 12 years and four elections. So, mind you, one of them was when I called a special election on myself. So Parliament will generally in Britain go for about 4 years. This one, the current one, might go for about 5 years. Usually if a Parliament goes for 5 years, it's a sign that the government's unpopular because they're trying to delay the election for as long as possible.
Right. And I guess one thing with elections, it seems like they only last like a couple weeks. Like here, it feels like the presidential election's already started, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, because you've got fixed term elections in America, it's both an advantage and a disadvantage because you know when future elections are going to happen. Irrespective of what happens, you know that there will be a presidential election every 4 years. That basically means you've got lots of time to prepare. In Britain, there'll be an election, at some point I think over the next 18 months. No one can be quite sure.
So, like, what was the time frame from deciding to jump in to run for parliament to getting elected? How that worked for you over there?
Well, when I first ran for office, it was 2001, and I stood against the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom called Tony Blair in his home district, and I wasn't expected to win, but I fought it like I was determined to. I had a very low budget. He was at the height of his powers, and I managed to reduce his majority pretty significantly. I literally knocked on every door in the neighbourhood. And I kind of used the fact that it was just me and a handful of volunteers to my advantage. He turned up at a debate with this great big entourage of buses and police cars and all the rest of it. And I literally got out the back of a beat up old car. And I tried to use that being the kind of the underdog. And I think that kind of taught me actually how to run against Westminster, how to run against the establishment, how to run an insurgency.
Because Blair's one prime minister has done quite well post being in that office.
I'm sure he has.
Enriched himself.
I'm sure he has. I mean, it's quite a reflection of British, and whatever you think about Tony Blair, don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of his, I ran against him. But it's quite a reflection on the calibre of politicians in Britain that you think back to Tony Blair, whether you supported him or not, and see him as being quite a big beast. And you look at some of the rather puny people in office today, and what does that tell you? Not so much about Tony Blair. What does that tell you about the infantilization of the political process?
Right, people just tune out, don't care, don't think it really matters to them in a way.
Well, my point is more that whatever you think about Blair, he is a class act. Whatever you think about Bill Clinton, he was an extraordinary gifted communicator. I remember listening to things that Bill Clinton said in speeches 30 years ago. I'm not sure I would necessarily remember things that politicians say today.
Right, and I guess the fascinating thing is that Bill Clinton had a certain gravitas in that office. Obama, like him, dislike him, had a gravitas to that office. Joe Biden probably doesn't even know he's in the office.
I don't want to be unkind about Joe Biden, but there was an unwritten rule in American politics that if you were the president, you rose above partisan attacks. You didn't use your Twitter account to demonize Republicans in the House. You withstood a certain amount of criticism and you didn't respond. And I think that's gone now. And I think that's really worrying. And I'm an immigrant to America, and I say to my daughter, who is also a recent arrival to this country, I say to her that you might not approve of the person who is the President of the United States, and you will grow up sometimes finding the person in the Oval Office is not the person you voted for, but you need to respect them because they are in the office of the President of the United States. And for the Republic of the United States to survive, people need, I think, to recognize that whoever is in the Oval Office should be respected to some extent and not vilified. And in return for that, I think whoever's in the Oval Office should be slightly above some of that narrow. Yeah.
Because I guess in a way, Donald Trump, in some sense, kind of really started the punching down to a large extent with certain people.
I think you're right. Part of me, I think you're right. I think there were things he said that would have seemed at the time unpresidential. and I hope one day that sort of conduct will be seen as unpresidential again.
Right. Let's just hope stuff like that doesn't become the precedent for the future.
Absolutely. It's so important that people should be able to understand that they can fiercely disagree, but that in a democratic system, you need losers' consent. Just because your guy didn't win the election this time, it doesn't mean you have to try and do everything to delegitimize the person who got more votes than you.
Right.
But to be honest, there's an argument for saying that actually the people who started that process were the Clintonites
In 2000.
Yeah.
And also, too, I guess in 2000 with Al Gore, once they said he lost,
absolutely. All that talk about hanging chads. Did it make the Republic healthier or more ill?
Right. I guess then you continued with Clinton and Trump saying he won in 2020.
I think another thing is that the culture war. There was a tendency, and I think it really started with Bush the Younger, for political advisors around the president to use what they called wedge issues. And in order to maximize your vote, you would introduce a wedge issue to try to really drive up your base. And I think one of the toxic consequences of that use of wedge issues in politics, and both Democrats and Republicans have done it, is to drive apart, to create these two polar opposite camps. I think wedge issues, there's tendency to vilify and demonize your opponents. There's tendency of the president not to put themselves above the fray. They've all jeopardized, I think, what the founding fathers, the legacy of the founding.
I guess one consequence of that as well is declining trust in institutions across the spectrum, right? I mean, a lot less people trust, say, the FBI and CIA today than did 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a general decline in trust in institutions throughout the Western world, and some of that is misplaced, some of it's not misplaced. I mean, and I say this very carefully, but I was always brought up to believe that law enforcement were always the good guys, and I think we now realise that actually we want law enforcement to be the good guys, and mostly law enforcement are the good guys, but actually sometimes the law enforcement are not the good guys. And I think maybe a loss of deference to certain institutions is not a bad thing. Now, it can go too far, and I think we see this in the United States, where, among certain sections of the American commentariat, whatever the police do, they're always vilified and always accused of being wrong, and it's given rise to this very dangerous anti-police movement. I always, as someone who lives and works in Jackson, Mississippi, a town which has one of the highest homicide rates of any city in America, I always think it's absurd for people to be anti-law enforcement. The people who pay the price for this anti-police, anti-law enforcement, defund the police movement are ordinary folk in places like Jackson, Mississippi. They pay the price for these dangerous ideas. So, my point is, institutions should be respected, but we should not be blind to the failings of institutions.
And I guess, speaking on crime in Jackson, Mississippi and the issues it entails, what are your thoughts on the expansion of the Capital Improvement District in large jurisdiction, along with adding additional judges and prosecutors that aren't elected by Hinds County?
As a person who works and lives in Jackson, as a father of someone who lives in Jackson, as the husband of someone who lives and shops in Jackson, I'm all in favour of this. Why? We've got one of the highest homicide rates in the country. The criminal justice system has not been as effective as it should be. And the fact that we are getting the extension of the Capitol Police's jurisdiction, and we're getting courts and public prosecutors to actually tackle crime, is good. But there's a small part of me which also questions how far we should go with this. Every time state government steps in to try to tackle Jackson City problems, it's really tackling a symptom of the problem in Jackson. It's tackling a failure of policing or a failure of public prosecution, or when they step in to create a new water authority, they're jumping in to tackle the symptoms of municipal maladministration. I fear that it's not attacking the root cause of the problem, which is a lack of accountability. I can't think of any other city in Mississippi where city leadership has failed so demonstrably and been able to get away with it. Ultimately, the only way to deal with Jackson's problems are for voters in Jackson to recognise the consequences of the choices they make on election day. If you are going to elect into public office people who have a record that suggests they're not up to the job, you're going to be governed by people who are likely not to be up to the job. So, yes, I welcome intervention, but at some point, if Jackson, our state capital, is to be a viable city, and I think it should be a viable city, we need to recognise that the solution to problems made in Jackson has to come from voters in Jackson.
Right. And I guess you kind of have to, if you really want to change it, get at the root causes of it, education, right? Regulation, and bring some businesses. And
I was talking to a couple of business owners that have moved out of Jackson, and one of them said to me, "You just can't run a restaurant without running water." It's too difficult. And once your business base moves, your tax base goes. And once your tax base and your businesses and your jobs go, that said, I think things could be fixed. These are failings of public policy, and Mississippi Center for Public Policy is a public policy think tank. These problems can be fixed by good public policy. I think it's good. Here's the ridiculous thing when talking about the state stepping in to fix Jackson's problems. Before the state stepped in to fix Jackson's problems, the state officials were vilified by the mainstream media for doing nothing. Then when they got involved, they're now being vilified for getting involved. They're attacked when they do, they're attacked when they don't. I have a lot of sympathy for state officials who are trying to tackle Jackson's problems.
right, because I guess in a way it's hard to be a state official and not step in when it's not being solved.
Not only that, it's your capital city.
Right.
And, we have a massive brain drain in Mississippi. If you want to tackle the brain drain, if you want young Mississippians from every background to stay and make their home in Mississippi, you can't ignore the fact that I think something like 40% of graduates from Jackson State and Mississippi State and Ole Miss take their first job in and around the Jackson metro area. So if the Jackson metro area is not a great place to live, you're going to increase the number of people who move out in their 20s. You've got to tackle Jackson's problems. I can't help noticing as well that Austin, Dallas, Atlanta, Nashville, these thriving cities all have great airports. If city officials can't run a water system, some might say they couldn't even run a bath because there's no water to run it. How can we trust them to run an airport? How can we thrive as a city if we don't have a functioning airport?
And I think that's one thing you saw is I think they're trying to take away the airport from Jackson, or there's a push to do that, right?
Yeah, we need to have a hub airport here. Mississippi doesn't have a large airport, and that is why a lot of the growth goes to Nashville. That's why a lot of the growth goes to Birmingham. Big airports.
I mean, just from the podcast, right? I mean, it'd be a lot easier if I do this a lot and do it full time to be in somewhere like New Orleans, right? It's a lot easier to bring guests in and get people into the city.
Yeah. But it's a solvable problem. The laws of aerodynamics are the same in Mississippi as elsewhere. We can have a functioning airport with lots of air traffic. What we need to do is make sure that we have officials who are up to the job.
And I guess just one question to round us out, something I'm curious about, given your move from UK to United States, is kind of your thoughts on guns and the Second Amendment.
The British tradition is very different.
Right.
Britain was not founded like the United States in rebellion against an autocratic monarch. And And so there's not that tradition that there is in the United States. There's not a Bill of Rights in Britain. I'm not one of those Brits who moves to America and complains that things in America aren't like they are in Britain. I actually love the fact that things in America are like they are in America. One of the wonderful things about America is that it's, generally speaking, a free society. If you want to do stuff and you don't bother anyone else, you can pretty much do it. And, when people in the UK come to the United States, I think, personally speaking from my experience, I've found in 1,000 different ways that America is exhilarating because it's free. If you want to own a gun in the United States, you can own a gun. Great, fantastic. If I felt really strongly about it, I'd go live in, I don't know, Boston or London.
Right. And I guess that's the beauty of America too, is you have so many different places. It's such a big country. And I guess that's probably, and could you have decentralized power in a country as small as England? Would it make sense to work?
I think you could, and not so long ago you did. The corruption of the British constitutional system really started in 1918, when the requirement for ministers to face special elections, confirmation elections, and then there were a series of changes in the House of Commons standing orders that basically denied elected politicians real control over budget setting. Since then, central government grew and local government lost control over finances, and it became basically a franchise of central government. You could very easily go back to, not very easily, it'd be perfectly possible to go back to a properly localized system in Britain. I advocated for this, and in fact I wrote a series of papers called the Localist Papers, modelled off the Federalist Papers, but advocating not for federalism but for localism. And I remember in one of them arguing that Essex, which was my county, I think if it was an independent state, would be, I think, the 37th largest state in population terms in the Union. So, if Iowa and Rhode Island and Connecticut can each be autonomous states in America, different counties in Britain could certainly have similar
setups.
And the real example of this in Europe, of course, is Switzerland. Switzerland, very interestingly, had their constitution devised at about the time that Andrew Jackson was all the rage in America. And there's a very strong and directly American Jacksonian imprint in the Swiss canton system. People often think of the Swiss system as evolving separately. I think the convergent evolution between the Swiss system and the American system was strongly influenced by the Jacksonian example in the United States.
And I guess one thing with the Swiss system that's interesting is the executive power is kind of shared by the council, essentially, kind of a figurehead who serves as president.
Yeah. And the Swiss system shows that the federal model of shared power, separation of power, can work at a micro level. I think Switzerland, if it was a state, would fit into Texas several times. America shows that it can work at a continental level. And one thing I hadn't really appreciated until I moved to the United States, even within a state, there is an extraordinary separation of powers. Different counties do things differently. It's wonderful.
It is. Unique place, for sure. Douglas, I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much. Best of luck with this podcast.
I haven't kept you too long. And
yeah.
Any thoughts on royal family and new King Charles? Do you think he's doing pretty good, or?
Well, I'm often asked about this in America. I mean, I think his mother was an extraordinary example. She was queen and conducted her duties as a monarch extraordinarily well over a long period of time. I think I'm right in saying she met every American president in office from Harry Truman right through to Joe Biden, with one exception, showing her exquisite judgment. that being LBJ. She never met LBJ, but she met all the others. I think King Charles has a very, very, very good template to follow. I do worry about his name though. Having a King Charles has never worked out too well in England. I hope he's the exception.
Right, and I guess his history is he's a lot more opinionated on certain issues or climate change. And
I think it's really important that a monarch reads a book by Bagehot in the 19th century, which basically made it clear that the job of a monarch is to look the part and to act the part, but to say very little. If in pursuit of short-term popularity, or even just because he believes it, he starts articulating views about public policy, it won't end well.
right, and I guess he has a dysfunctional family with Harry and Meghan over here. It's kind of doing
And
their.
I think most families have that rather awkward uncle who, is a bit of an embarrassment, and most families don't have an uncle who can get the world's attention by articulating their own petty grievances to a worldwide audience. I wouldn't take it too seriously.
Right. They made a lot of money doing it though. $30 million.
I wish him well. I'm just sorry that we exported Harry Windsor to America.
Hey, good cultural export.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Good. Fantastic.
Guys, that was an incredible interview. I gained a lot from it. First off, I want to give a big shout out and thanks to Douglas Carswell and the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. Their hospitality was unmatched, and they gave us an incredible hour, which I think we all learned a lot from. Additionally, we'll have a lot more articles, social media, and other things coming along that will keep you interested. So be on the lookout, and remember, hit that subscribe and like button. Thanks for tuning in to the Ford Focus. Have a nice day. God bless America.